Sirens tore through the Moscow night, sharp and unfamiliar, echoing between apartment blocks that had been promised permanent safety. Flames flickered against the skyline. Thick columns of black smoke climbed into the winter air, visible from miles away. For a city conditioned to believe the war would never reach it, the shock was immediate and profound. This was not Kyiv. This was not Kharkiv. This was Moscow itself, the heart of Russian political power, suddenly thrust into the reality of war. In the earliest hours of the night, multiple districts across the Moscow region were struck by coordinated waves of unmanned aerial vehicles. Russian emergency services confirmed fires at key infrastructure sites, including a major electrical substation critical to the capital's power grid, and a fuel storage facility on the outskirts of the city. Power disruptions rippled through nearby neighborhoods as emergency crews raced to contain blazes that illuminated the sky. Social media footage, later geolocated by open-source analysts, showed massive smoke plumes rising over southwestern and southeastern districts, while sirens wailed across a metropolis unaccustomed to hearing them for real. The scale and precision of the attack marked a historic rupture. This was not a symbolic gesture or a fleeting provocation. It was the most serious and damaging strike on Moscow since the war began, and it shattered a psychological barrier the Kremlin had carefully preserved. For nearly 2 years, the Russian public had been assured that the conflict was distant, controlled, and contained. Tonight, that illusion collapsed in real time. Moscow has always been more than a city. It is the symbolic nerve center of the Russian state, the seat of political authority, and the ultimate reassurance to citizens that the war existed somewhere else. The belief in Moscow's invulnerability was central to the Kremlin's narrative of stability and strength. When fires burn in the capital, that narrative becomes impossible to sustain. What makes this moment so consequential is not merely the physical damage, but the message embedded within it. Ukraine's strike signals a dramatic shift in the rules governing this conflict. The strategy of absorbing attacks on civilian infrastructure while appealing only to international outrage has reached its limit. The cost of terrorizing Ukrainian cities will now be imposed directly on the core of Russian power. The implications are immediate and dangerous. Once a capital city becomes a viable target, escalation accelerates and restraint erodes. Psychological sanctuaries vanish. Leaders are forced to confront risks they once dismissed as unthinkable. The war no longer exists solely on distant battlefields. It intrudes into the political and emotional center of the state itself. Tonight, Moscow burned, and with it burned the last credible claim that this war could be geographically confined. The fires, the sirens, and the smoke rising above familiar neighborhoods announce a new phase of the conflict, one defined by direct vulnerability and heightened peril. The question now is no longer whether the war can reach Moscow, but how far the consequences of this night will spread. For millions watching from their windows or phones, the meaning was unmistakable. The boundary separating front line and home front had dissolved. A war sold as remote had arrived personally, violently, and without warning, forcing an entire nation to confront a reality long denied by its leaders and their assurances. To understand why Ukrainian drones struck Moscow, the timeline must rewind only a few hours earlier to another city that has become grimly familiar with air raid sirens and burning buildings. Before smoke rose over the Russian capital, Kyiv was once again under attack. In the dark hours before dawn, Russia unleashed a large-scale barrage of missiles and drones against Ukraine's capital and other major population centers, continuing a campaign that has defined much of the war's most brutal phase. Dozens of cruise missiles and Iranian-designed Shahed drones descended on Kyiv, overwhelming air defenses through sheer volume. Residential neighborhoods were struck, power generation facilities were damaged, heating and water infrastructure was disrupted at the coldest point of winter, when electricity is not a convenience but a necessity for survival. Ukrainian officials reported multiple fatalities and injuries as emergency crews searched rubble and worked to restore basic services under constant threat of renewed strikes. This assault followed a now well-established Kremlin pattern. When Russian forces fail to achieve decisive results on the battlefield, the response shifts towards civilian civilian punishment. Rather than targeting purely military objectives, Russia has repeatedly focused on energy grids, apartment buildings, and urban infrastructure, aiming to exhaust the population and erode morale. The logic is simple and brutal. Make daily life unbearable, and resistance will eventually collapse. Yet time and again, this strategy has failed. Instead of breaking Ukrainian resolve, each wave of attacks has reinforced it. International condemnation has mounted, Western support has deepened, and within Ukraine, public anger has hardened into determination. What changed on this night was not Ukrainian resilience, but Ukrainian restraint. For much of the conflict, Kyiv deliberately limited its deep strikes into Russian territory. Ukrainian operations focused on occupied Crimea, border regions, and logistical nodes directly supporting Russian military activity. Even when drones struck oil depots or airfields inside Russia, the scale and messaging remained controlled. Moscow itself remained untouched, a boundary implicitly respected despite its role in directing and sustaining the war. That boundary no longer exists. The timing of the strike on Moscow strongly suggests it was neither improvised nor reactive in a tactical sense. The near immediate response indicates the existence of pre-approved contingency plans, allowing Ukrainian forces to retaliate rapidly in the event of major attacks on civilian infrastructure. This was not a spontaneous decision made in anger. It was a calculated response, waiting for a threshold to be crossed. From Ukraine's perspective, that threshold was crossed the moment Russian missiles once again plunged millions of civilians into darkness and cold. The message accompanying Ukraine's retaliation was unambiguous. If Ukrainian cities are treated as legitimate targets, then the Russian capital can no longer claim immunity. The costs of the war will no longer be confined to Ukrainian territory. This marks a fundamental shift in Ukrainian strategy. Rather than relying solely on moral arguments and international pressure, Kyiv has demonstrated a willingness to impose direct consequences on the Russian state. The intent is not indiscriminate harm, but deterrence through reciprocity, signaling that attacks on civilians will generate painful responses at the highest symbolic level. For Moscow, this creates an uncomfortable reality. The war it sought to present as distant and controlled has become immediate and personal. The attack on Kyiv was intended to project dominance and inevitability. Instead, it triggered a response that carried the conflict directly to Russia's center of power. The path from Kyiv to Moscow was not accidental. It was forged by repeated choices, repeated escalations, and a refusal to recognize limits. What followed was not the start of a new war, but the consequence of one already pushed beyond restraint. What elevates the strike on Moscow from a political shock to a military watershed is not simply that it happened, but how it happened. Moscow is not an exposed city. It sits beneath one of the densest, most layered air defense networks on the planet, a system built for decades to defend against everything from cruise missiles to strategic bombers. That Ukrainian drones were able to penetrate this shield and strike meaningful targets represents a significant and unsettling revelation. At the core of Moscow's defenses are long-range S-400 Triumph systems designed to detect and engage aerial threats hundreds of kilometers away, paired with shorter-range Panzer systems intended to intercept drones, missiles, and aircraft that slip through outer layers. These systems are integrated with radar arrays, electronic warfare units, and centralized command structures meant to provide overlapping coverage and rapid response. In theory, this architecture should make a successful attack on the capital extraordinarily difficult, and yet it was breached. Military analysts examining the strike point to several likely factors working in combination. One is the possibility that Ukraine employed a new or upgraded generation of long-range domestically produced drones. Over the past 2 years, Ukraine has invested heavily in indigenous drone development, emphasizing extended range, navigation autonomy, and reduced radar visibility. These systems do not need to be invisible. They need only be difficult enough to detect to complicate interception timelines. lines. Another critical element may have been electronic warfare. By jamming or spoofing Russian radar and communication systems, attacking drones can create temporary blind spots or false targets, degrading the defender's ability to distinguish real threats from noise. When combined with saturation tactics, launching multiple drones simultaneously from different directions, defensive systems can be overwhelmed, forcing operators to make split-second decisions under intense pressure. Flight profile also matters. Low-altitude, terrain-following routes can allow drones to remain below radar coverage for much of their journey, only appearing on sensors moments before impact. If Ukrainian planners possessed detailed intelligence on the placement, coverage arcs, and response times of Moscow's defenses, they could exploit small but decisive gaps in the system. There is also speculation about the use of modified or jet-powered drones capable of higher speeds and heavier payloads than earlier Ukrainian designs. While no foreign government has acknowledged supplying such systems, the sophistication of the attack suggests long preparation and possibly technical knowledge drawn from international cooperation, even if indirectly. What is beyond dispute is that the targets were not random. Striking an electrical substation and a fuel storage facility indicates deliberate selection aimed at disruption rather than mass casualties. These are high-value infrastructure nodes whose damage carries both practical consequences and symbolic weight. This was a mission planned with precision, patience, and strategic intent. For Russia, the implications are deeply troubling. Defending a vast country against relatively low-cost drones is an asymmetrical challenge. Every interceptor missile fired costs exponentially more than the drone it destroys. Every additional air defense unit assigned to Moscow is one less protecting military assets elsewhere. The cost curve overwhelmingly favors the attacker. For Ukraine, the success of the operation validates a strategy centered on innovation rather than parity. It demonstrates that advanced integrated air defenses, while formidable, are not impenetrable. It also sends a message that technological adaptation can offset material disadvantages, reshaping the balance of deterrence. Perhaps most consequentially, the breach of Moscow's defenses strips away the aura of invulnerability surrounding Russia's core. Once that perception is lost, it cannot easily be restored. Future defenses may improve, but the knowledge that the shield can be pierced will linger, altering calculations on both sides and permanently changing how this war is fought. The data gathered from this strike will now be studied relentlessly by both sides, refining tactics and countermeasures, but the fundamental truth remains unchanged. The technical barrier protecting Moscow has been crossed, and once crossed, it can never again be considered absolute or secure fully. For much of this war, an unspoken boundary existed. Ukrainian drones could strike fuel depots, airfields, and logistical hubs deep inside Russia, but Moscow itself remained largely untouched. This was not simply a matter of military difficulty, it was a psychological red line, one that both sides appeared to recognize even as the conflict escalated elsewhere. That red line has now vanished. Moscow occupies a unique position in Russian political consciousness. It is not just the capital, but the embodiment of state power, historical continuity, and national identity. As long as the city remained secure, the Kremlin could sustain the narrative that the war was distant and controlled, a necessary operation conducted far from the everyday lives of most Russians. The illusion of normalcy in Moscow was central to maintaining political stability. The strike on the capital shatters that illusion completely. History offers stark parallels. During the Second World War, Allied bombing campaigns against Berlin and Tokyo did more than destroy factories or transportation networks. They forced populations to confront the reality of total war and stripped authoritarian regimes of their claims to absolute control and protection. In a modern context, the attack on Moscow carries a similar symbolic weight, even if the scale of destruction is far smaller. Within the trajectory of the Ukraine war, this moment did not arise suddenly. It is the culmination of a gradual expansion of the battlefield. The destruction of the Kerch Bridge demonstrated that even iconic symbols of Russian power were vulnerable. Subsequent strikes on airfields hundreds of kilometers from the front lines confirmed Ukraine's growing reach. Attacks near St. Petersburg signaled that no region was entirely beyond range. Each step pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. Moscow was the final boundary. Crossing it fundamentally alters the conflict's psychological and strategic dimensions. Capital cities have long been treated as de facto sanctuaries in conventional interstate wars, particularly in Europe. That assumption no longer holds. The proliferation of long-range unmanned systems has made geographic distance and traditional defenses far less reliable guarantors of safety. The implications extend far beyond Russia and Ukraine. Defense planners around the world are paying close attention to what this strike represents. If one of the most heavily defended capitals on Earth can be penetrated by relatively low-cost drones, then no city can assume immunity. This challenges long-standing doctrines about air defense, urban security, and the protection of political leadership. For the Kremlin, the disappearance of this red line creates an acute dilemma. Responding forcefully risks further escalation and potential overreach. Responding weakly undermines authority and invites future attacks. The balance between deterrence and restraint becomes far more precarious when the symbolic heart of the state is exposed. For Ukraine, crossing this line establishes a new form of leverage. The knowledge that Moscow itself is vulnerable becomes a powerful deterrent tool, one that can shape Russian decision-making even if no further strikes occur. The mere possibility imposes psychological pressure that cannot be undone. Most significantly, this moment accelerates the erosion of a concept that has underpinned modern warfare, the idea of a secure rear area. In an age of inexpensive, adaptable, long-range drones, sanctuary is increasingly an illusion. The strike on Moscow does not simply redraw the map of this war. It signals a broader transformation in how wars will be fought and experienced in the 21st century. Once a red line disappears, it does not return. It becomes a reminder, embedded in strategic thinking on all sides, that the boundaries separating battlefield and home front have permanently blurred. For Vladimir Putin, the strike on Moscow represents a direct challenge to the foundations of his authority. His rule has long been justified by a central promise that he alone can guarantee stability, security, and order after the chaos of the post-Soviet era. An attack of this scale on the capital, regardless of its immediate military impact, strikes at the heart of that promise and exposes a vulnerability that cannot be easily explained away. The political symbolism is devastating. Images of smoke rising over Moscow, of emergency vehicles racing through familiar streets, and of power disruptions in the nation's most protected city undermine the narrative of control that sustains the regime. Even brief breaches of security in the capital resonate far beyond their physical damage, sending a signal that the state is not as omnipotent as it claims. Inside the Kremlin, pressure will be intense and immediate. The Ministry of Defense and the Federal Security Service, the FSB, will be required to account for how such an attack was possible. In systems built on personal loyalty and centralized authority, failures of this magnitude rarely pass without consequence. History suggests a familiar pattern will follow: internal investigations, quiet removals, public scapegoating, and an intensified search for those deemed responsible for intelligence or defensive lapses. State-controlled media now faces a delicate task. Minimizing the strike risks public disbelief, as residents have already seen and heard the evidence themselves. Acknowledging its significance, however, risks amplifying fear and anger. The regime may attempt to reframe the attack as an act of foreign-backed terrorism or as proof of a wider existential threat, hoping to channel shock into nationalist resolve rather than doubt. The political compact between the Kremlin and Moscow's elite is also under strain. For years, the professional and wealthy classes of the capital have been largely insulated from the war's physical dangers, experiencing it through television screens and economic side effects. The attack punctures that insulation, undermining the sense of personal safety that has encouraged quiet compliance. While open dissent remains unlikely under conditions of repression, anxiety and private disillusionment are likely to grow. Economically, the immediate damage from the strike is manageable. Power outages and fuel losses can be repaired. The deeper impact lies in perception. Moscow has been viewed as a secure administrative and financial center, even as the broader economy absorbed the shocks of sanctions and war. That perception has now been recalibrated. Investors, both domestic and foreign, must reassess risk in a city no longer considered immune. This psychological shock could accelerate capital flight, encourage the relocation of key personnel, and increase pressure on an already strained banking system. The government's ability to manage the ruble and control inflation, while tested repeatedly, now faces an additional stressor that monetary tools alone may struggle to contain. Strategically, the strike imposes a costly dilemma. Defending Moscow and other major cities will require the redeployment of air defense systems, interceptor missiles, and trained crews. Every resource assigned to urban defense is a resource diverted from protecting military assets and logistics hubs elsewhere, including occupied territories in Ukraine. This diversion represents a tangible strategic gain for Kiev. The financial burden of reinforcing metropolitan defenses, hardening infrastructure, and maintaining heightened readiness will further strain a state budget already stretched by military spending and declining revenues. Over time, these pressures compound, eroding the sustainability of a war effort built on the assumption that the home front would remain untouched. In political terms, the strike does not threaten the regime's immediate survival, but it chips away at the pillars of legitimacy, confidence, and perceived competence. Once shaken, these foundations are difficult to fully restore, especially as the war continues to intrude into spaces once considered untouchable. The strike on Moscow reverberates far beyond Russia and Ukraine, forcing governments around the world to reassess assumptions about escalation, restraint, and the boundaries of modern warfare. Capital cities are not merely administrative centers, they are symbols of sovereignty and stability. When one is successfully struck, the shock waves travel through diplomatic channels, military headquarters, and financial markets worldwide. For Ukraine's Western allies, the moment is deeply uncomfortable. Publicly, officials will reaffirm Ukraine's right to self-defense and emphasize that responsibility for the escalation lies squarely with Russia's continued attacks on civilian infrastructure. The narrative will stress inevitability that a war prosecuted with terror against cities will eventually bring consequences at home. At the same time, private conversations will be more cautious. Behind closed doors, there will be urgent appeals to Kiev to maintain focus on military and strategic targets, mindful of alliance cohesion and public support. NATO will quietly raise its alertness, not because of immediate involvement, but due to the uncertainty surrounding Russia's response. Any Russian attempt to expand strikes toward NATO supply routes or border regions would dramatically increase the risk of direct confrontation. As a result, alliance planners will scrutinize force postures in Eastern Europe, reinforcing deterrence while trying to avoid actions that could be interpreted as provocation. For countries in the global south, the attack underscores the war's widening scope and the fragility of assumptions about containment. Some governments will see the attack as confirmation that escalation is spiraling out of control, reinforcing calls for an immediate ceasefire. Others will interpret it as proof that aggression carries costs, even for powerful states. In either case, the perception of a destabilizing conflict will harden, influencing diplomatic alignments and energy markets. China's reaction will be measured but uneasy. Beijing will issue statements expressing concern and urging restraint, reiterating its preference for dialogue. Privately, however, the implications are troubling. A successful strike on the capital of a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council challenges long-held assumptions about deterrence and strategic depth. Chinese analysts will study the vulnerabilities exposed in Russia's air defenses, drawing lessons that extend well beyond Eastern Europe and into their own strategic calculations. Other major powers, including India and Brazil, will view the escalation as a warning about the risks of prolonged hedging. The attack highlights the potential for global economic and security spillover, increasing pressure on neutral or non-aligned states to engage more actively in diplomatic efforts, if only to protect their own interests. Perhaps the most consequential global implication is the normalization of strategic strikes against capital cities in conventional warfare. For decades, even intense conflicts often respected an implicit boundary around political centers, particularly in Europe. That boundary is now eroding. Governments worldwide will take note, accelerating investment in counter-drone systems, urban air defenses, and infrastructure hardening. The danger lies in the escalation ladder now unfolding. Russia's options are limited and all carry significant risks. A massive retaliatory strike on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure could further galvanize international support for Kiev while deepening humanitarian catastrophe. Expanded attacks on Western-supplied logistics hubs would flirt with direct confrontation. Nuclear signaling, even rhetoricical, would inject extreme volatility into an already tense environment. Cyber operations and covert actions are also likely to intensify, targeting government networks, financial systems, and critical infrastructure far from the battlefield. Each move increases the chance of miscalculation, where intent and perception diverge with catastrophic consequences. The world is now watching not just what Russia and Ukraine do, but how quickly restraint can erode once symbolic centers are placed within reach. The strike on Moscow has compressed decision-making timelines everywhere, raising the stakes for every actor involved. What happens after the night Moscow was struck will define the next and most dangerous phase of this war. A Russian response is not a question of if, but when, and the form it takes will shape the trajectory of the conflict for months, possibly years to come. The Kremlin now faces a narrow and perilous set of choices, each carrying serious risks. The most immediate and likely response is a severe escalation against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Russian forces may attempt to reassert dominance through sheer scale and brutality. This move would deepen the humanitarian crisis while reinforcing international support for Ukraine, but it remains a familiar and politically accessible option for Moscow. Another path involves widening the conflict indirectly. Russia could intensify strikes on logistics hubs in western Ukraine, push closer to NATO borders, or increase covert operations and cyber attacks against Western government and economic infrastructure. These actions would test red lines without crossing them outright, raising tension while preserving plausible deniability. The most alarming scenario involves strategic signaling, nuclear rhetoric, changes in alert status, or large-scale military exercises could be used to project resolve and intimidate adversaries. Even without actual use, such signals would inject extreme volatility into global security calculations and elevate the risk of misinterpretation. For Ukraine, the period ahead demands maximum vigilance. Demonstrating the ability to strike Moscow has altered Russia's strategic calculus, but it also places Ukraine squarely in the crosshairs of retaliation. The challenge now is to balance deterrence with survival, leveraging the psychological impact of this strike without triggering uncontrollable escalation. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the long-term significance of this moment is unmistakable. The war has crossed into territory with little modern precedent. Capital cities are no longer assumed sanctuaries. The concept of a secure rear has eroded. Modern warfare, shaped by drones and precision strikes, has collapsed the distance between front lines and centers of power. This reality will echo far beyond Ukraine and Russia, influencing military planning, diplomacy, and global security doctrine for years to come. The conflict has not merely intensified, it has transformed. If you want clear, in-depth analysis as this situation evolves, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Like this video to help others understand why this moment matters. And comment below, what do you think Russia's next move will be? This war has entered its most dangerous chapter yet, and the consequences are still unfolding.